Nevada is the third most seismically hazardous state in the United States, right behind Alaska and California, and on April 13th, a magnitude 5.7 earthquake tore through western Nevada, shallow and sharp, and the shaking didn't stop at the state line. It crossed a mountain range. People felt it in Sacramento, in Modesto, in Grass Valley. For a 5.7, that kind of reach is not normal, and the fault system responsible has a name that most Americans can't name. We're going to say it. We're going to explain exactly what it is, what it's done before, and why what happened on April 13th might be the opening statement of something much larger. Don't go anywhere. If you enjoy what we do here, hit like and subscribe to Project Nightwatch. Because the Walker Lane is not done, and we will be here for every development as this sequence unfolds. If you live in the corridor right now, Reno, Carson City, Fernley, Silver Springs, anywhere along that Interstate 80 stretch, drop a comment and tell us what you felt. Did the shaking wake you up? Did it feel different from earthquakes you felt before? How long did it last? We want to hear from the people actually standing on this fault system. Now let's get into it. Part 1. The moment the Walker Lane lit up. The ground moved on April 13th, 2026, and most people who felt it had no idea what they were standing on. At approximately 8:47 in the evening local time, a magnitude 5.7 earthquake tore through the crust of western Nevada near a small desert town called Silver Springs, a place most Americans could not find on a map, sitting roughly 30 miles east of Reno, in a flat, sun-baked corridor between mountain ranges that looks, to the untrained eye, like nothing in particular. Quiet, empty, geologically unremarkable, except it is none of those things. And on the night of April 13th, the ground beneath that corridor broke, and it told anyone paying attention something important, something that the usual earthquake conversation in this country almost entirely misses. The shaking registered shallow. That detail matters more than most people realize. The hypercenter, the actual point of rupture beneath the surface, sat somewhere between 5 and 9 kilometers down, which is genuinely close to the surface in geological terms. When an earthquake ruptures that shallow, the energy does not have far to travel before it hits the ground you're standing on. It arrives fast, unfiltered, punchy. People in Reno reported it as sharp and jarring. Carson City felt it clearly. Fernley, which sits directly in the fault zone's path, rattled hard, and then the shaking kept going, traveling west across the Sierra Nevada foothills, reaching the Sacramento Valley in California, where people in Davis, Modesto, Grass Valley, and the broader Sacramento metropolitan area reported feeling the ground move. Think about that distance for a moment. A magnitude 5.7 earthquake, which is not small but is also not catastrophic, was felt across hundreds of miles of terrain. That is not normal attenuation behavior for an event of that size. That is a system telling you something about the architecture of the crust it is moving through. The initial magnitude assessments from the United States Geological Survey and the European Mediterranean Seismological Center came in quickly and in rough agreement. Magnitude 5.7, shallow crustal event, western Nevada. Seismologists watching the data in real time noted the wide felt footprint almost immediately. The numbers did not quite match the expected range. A 5.7 should fade into the background noise well before it crosses a mountain range and starts waking people up in the Central Valley of California. The fact that it did not is the first clue that something structural, something about the specific geology of this region, and the specific fault system that just ruptured, was amplifying and directing the energy in ways that are worth understanding. And understanding them starts with naming the system responsible, which most people, including most people who cover earthquakes for a living, did not do on the night of April 13th. Almost no one said the words Walker Lane. You will hear about the San Andreas. You will hear about Cascadia. These are the names embedded in the public imagination, the fault lines that have colonized the cultural understanding of earthquake risk in the western United States. The San Andreas runs up the California coast and is responsible for the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, the most famous tectonic event in American history, the one that destroyed a city. Cascadia sits offshore in the Pacific Northwest and is the subject of approximately one terrifying long-form article per year, each one explaining in careful detail how a magnitude 9 or greater megathrust rupture will one day generate a tsunami and destroy Seattle, Portland, and the Oregon coast simultaneously. These are real hazards. They deserve the attention they get. But they have also created a geography of fear that leaves enormous blind spots, regions where the crust is actively deforming, where strain is accumulating, where large earthquakes have happened repeatedly in living memory, and where almost nobody is watching. The Walker Lane is one of those regions. In fact, the Walker Lane may be the single most consequential seismic blind spot in the United States. And on April 13, 2026, it ruptured directly beneath a populated corridor in one of the fastest growing states in the country, and the national conversation moved on within hours. Here is what the Walker Lane actually is, in the simplest terms possible. It is a roughly 100-kilometre wide belt of distributed faulting that runs along the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada, extending from eastern California northward through Nevada and into the northern basin and range province. It is not a single fault. That is the first and most important thing to understand about it. The San Andreas is a single fault, a clean, mappable, terrifying line that you can trace on a map with your finger. The Walker Lane is more like a zone of damage, a braided system of strike-slip faults, normal faults, and fault junctions where the crust is not breaking along one clean line, but across a width of terrain that spans the distance between downtown Reno and the Utah border. And through that entire zone, the Pacific tectonic plate is dragging against the North American plate, not cleanly, not along a single boundary, but distributed, spread out across dozens of fault strands, some well mapped, some poorly understood, some possibly not yet identified at all. This is the system that just moved, not a local fault, not a routine Nevada quake. The Walker Lane, an active, distributed plate boundary scale deformation system, released stress on the night of April 13th, and the shaking was felt from the Nevada desert to the California Central Valley. The question is not whether that matters. The question is why almost nobody is talking about it. The aftershocks started coming within minutes. Magnitude 2.6, magnitude 3.1, magnitude 3.7. They kept arriving through the night, dozens of them, clustering in a spatial pattern that seismologists watching the real-time data found immediately interesting. They were not stacking up in a neat circular cloud around the main shock epicenter the way aftershocks often do after a simple, single-fault rupture. They were elongated, strung out along a northeast to southwest trending corridor, and that orientation matches something specific. It matches the structural grain of the Walker Lane fault system beneath the surface, the geometry of the faults that were already there before April 13th and that are now, in the wake of the main shock, continuing to adjust and rebalance. The crust is not done talking. It rarely is immediately after an event like this, but the pattern of how it is talking gives you a picture of the machinery underneath, and the machinery underneath is more complex, more interconnected, and more capable of producing larger events than a magnitude 5.7 alone would suggest. Part 2. The aftershock corridor that should not be ignored. There is a standard model in seismology for how aftershocks behave after a moderate earthquake. It is called Omori's law, named after the Japanese seismologist Fusakichi Omori, who formalized it in 1894. The core idea is elegant in its simplicity. Aftershocks decay in frequency over time following a predictable pattern. Many aftershocks immediately after the main shock, then fewer and fewer as time passes, following roughly a 1/time relationship. If you plot them on a graph, the frequency drops steeply at first, and then levels off into a long tail. It is one of the most robust statistical regularities in all of seismology. And it works, most of the time, for most earthquakes. What makes the Walker Lane complicated is that it does not always behave that way. The aftershock sequence that followed the April 13th magnitude 5.7 was not a clean Omori decay. It was clustered, spatially extended, and suggestive of what seismologists call distributed stress transfer, meaning the energy released by the main shock did not simply allow the crust around a single rupture plane to relax. Instead, it appears to have redistributed stress across multiple adjacent fault strands, each of which then began producing its own small earthquakes as they adjusted to their new stress environment. The result is an aftershock pattern that looks less like a single crack widening and healing, and more like the sound of a glass panel, not quite broken, but thoroughly crazed, with micro-fractures spreading out from the initial impact point in multiple directions simultaneously. This matters for a specific reason that connects directly back to the Walker Lane as a system. When aftershocks spread spatially across multiple fault strands rather than clustering tightly around a single main shock source, it is consistent with what geologists call fault network activation, the idea that a rupture on one fault strand can transfer enough stress to adjacent structures to bring them closer to their own failure thresholds. Not necessarily over the threshold, not necessarily triggering another large earthquake immediately, but closer. And closer matters in a system where some of those adjacent faults may have been accumulating strain for decades or longer. The spatial geometry of the aftershock sequence that followed the April 13th event showed elongation along the northeast to southwest structural trend of the Walker Lane. Individual aftershock clusters appeared at slightly different locations along this corridor rather than radiating symmetrically in all directions from the epicenter. Some of those clusters correspond to known fault strands in the region. Others occur in areas where the subsurface fault mapping is incomplete or uncertain, and that uncertainty is not a small caveat. In the Walker Lane, the uncertainty about what is down there is a fundamental feature of the hazard problem, not a footnote. The system is not fully mapped. Some of the faults that exist beneath the surface have never produced a historical earthquake large enough to be recorded, and in a desert region with sparse seismograph coverage until relatively recently, that means we genuinely do not know the full geometry of the system we are dealing with. Here is the open question that the aftershock sequence of April 13th raises, and that seismologists watching the data will be tracking for the next days to weeks. Did the main shock fully release the accumulated stress on the ruptured fault segment? Or did it partially rupture a larger locked section, leaving the remainder still loaded and potentially unstable? The distinction between these two scenarios is not academically interesting. It is the difference between a sequence that winds down over the coming weeks and one that is still building towards something larger. Statistically, for any given magnitude 5.7 earthquake, the probability that it turns out to be a foreshock to a larger event is somewhere between 5 and 10%. That sounds small, but it is not zero. And in a system as complex and as capable of multi-fault rupture as the Walker Lane, those probabilities are worth taking seriously. The window for watching the aftershock sequence evolve, and what it tells us about the system state, is days to weeks, not hours. The crust of western Nevada is still adjusting. The question is how far that adjustment goes. What the aftershocks have already confirmed, independently of any further escalation, is that the Walker Lane is active, not dormant, not theoretical, not a geological curiosity from the distant past. It ruptured on April 13th, and its secondary structures are still releasing energy as of the days following the event. That alone is significant, because the public narrative around this region treats it as a seismically quiet interior, Nevada as a place where nothing much happens, geologically speaking, compared to the dramatic coastal hazards of California and the Pacific Northwest. That narrative is wrong. It has always been wrong. And the April 13th magnitude 5.7 earthquake, minor as it may seem in isolation, is a direct challenge to it. The magnitude 5.7, the shallow rupture, the wide felt footprint, the elongated aftershock corridor, none of these are random. They are all expressions of the same underlying tectonic reality. The Walker Lane is a plate boundary scale fault system that is actively deforming the crust of the western United States, carrying a quarter of the total motion between two of Earth's largest tectonic plates, and routing that motion through a populated corridor that most hazard communication in this country essentially ignores. That is the story of April 13th. Not a moderate Nevada earthquake, a system revealing itself. Part 3. Why everyone is talking about the wrong fault. Let us be honest about something. The way earthquake awareness works in the United States is deeply geographic, in a way that does not actually track the underlying hazard. People know about the San Andreas because it runs through California, which is a state full of major media markets, major universities, and a cultural identity that has incorporated earthquake awareness into its civic mythology. The 1906 earthquake destroyed San Francisco. The 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake interrupted the World Series and was broadcast live to tens of millions of people. The 1994 Northridge earthquake hit the Los Angeles metropolitan area during morning rush hour. These events shaped collective memory, and they cemented the San Andreas as the name Americans reach for when they think about earthquake risk on the West Coast. Cascadia entered the popular consciousness more recently, largely through a single enormously influential magazine article published in The New Yorker in 2015 by Catherine Schultz, titled The Really Big One. That article, which won a Pulitzer Prize, explained in clear and frightening terms that the Cascadia subduction zone off the coast of the Pacific Northwest is capable of producing a magnitude 9 earthquake, and that the resulting tsunami would devastate a heavily populated coastline. The article was widely shared, widely read, and it permanently elevated Cascadia in the public hazard vocabulary. If you ask a reasonably informed American to name a dangerous fault, they will say San Andreas. If you ask them to name a second one, many of them will now say Cascadia. If you ask them to name a third one, almost none of them will say Walker Lane. This is a problem, and it is not just a problem of public communication. It reflects a genuine asymmetry in how earthquake hazard is perceived and discussed, and that asymmetry has real consequences for infrastructure investment, building codes, emergency preparedness, and land use planning in the states that the Walker Lane actually runs through. Here is a number that might reframe things. Nevada ranks third in the United States for seismic hazard, behind only Alaska and California. Not fourth, not eighth, third. In the United States Geological Survey's national seismic hazard models, the probability of experiencing strong ground shaking in parts of Nevada over a 50-year period is comparable to large sections of coastal California. The Reno-Carson City corridor, where hundreds of thousands of people live, where the region's fastest population growth over the past 2 decades has been concentrated, where major infrastructure including highways, bridges, water systems and the power grid serves a growing economy, sits directly within the Walker Lane deformation zone. The fault system that ruptured on April 13th does not run around Reno, it runs through it, and yet the public awareness of this hazard is a fraction of what exists around the San Andreas or Cascadia. Part of this is the nature of the Walker Lane itself. It is not a single dramatic fault line that you can draw on a map in one stroke. It is a distributed system, a zone of deformation that expresses itself as dozens of individual fault strands rather than one cleanly identifiable boundary. You cannot point at the Walker Lane the way you can point at the San Andreas and say, there it is. It is more diffuse than that, more geographically ambiguous, harder to communicate to a general audience. When the ground breaks along the San Andreas, the story tells itself, here is the fault, here is where it moved, here is the scar in the landscape. When the Walker Lane releases stress, the story is messier. Multiple fault strands, distributed energy release, spatial complexity that requires weeks of seismological analysis to fully characterize. That complexity is real, but it does not make the hazard smaller. If anything, it makes the hazard more insidious, because distributed systems can release energy across multiple fault strands in sequences that amplify the total damage beyond what any single rupture would produce. The population growth factor is not a small thing. Nevada is one of the fastest growing states in the country. The Las Vegas metropolitan area has been growing for decades, but the growth in the northern corridor, Reno, Sparks, Carson City, Fernley, the communities along the Interstate 80 corridor east of the Sierra Nevada, has accelerated significantly. People are moving to Nevada from California, in part because California's cost of living has become prohibitive, and in part because the Nevada high desert offers the kind of space and affordability that coastal California no longer does. Many of those people are moving from seismically aware communities in the Bay Area and Southern California into a region where the building stock is newer, but the hazard awareness is considerably lower. They are moving out of the shadow of one fault system and directly into the shadow of another one that almost nobody talks about. They do not know what they are standing on. This is the Walker Lane problem in human terms. There is also a fundamental mismatch between where the buildings are and where the earthquake preparedness resources are focused. California has among the most sophisticated earthquake engineering standards in the world. The state has spent decades upgrading vulnerable buildings, retrofitting unreinforced masonry structures, strengthening highway overpasses, and building public awareness campaigns around earthquake readiness. Nevada, which faces third-ranked seismic hazard, does not have the same culture of preparedness, does not have the same regulatory framework for building standards in high-hazard zones, and does not have the same public awareness infrastructure. The Walker Lane runs through the middle of this discrepancy, and the April 13th earthquake, which was felt across a wide corridor but did not produce casualties or major structural damage, was a reminder of what this system is capable of, because the history of this corridor includes events far larger than magnitude 5.7, and because the physics of the Walker Lane's fault network gives it the capacity to produce them again. Part 4. The first scientific red flags. The waveform data from the April 13th event started arriving at seismic monitoring networks within seconds of the rupture, and what that data showed, as analysts began working through it in the hours that followed the main shock, raised several questions that are still not fully resolved. The first and most immediately apparent anomaly was the wide felt footprint relative to the magnitude. Standard attenuation models for continental earthquakes predict how quickly ground motion diminishes with distance from the source. For a magnitude 5.7 at roughly 5 to 9 kilometers depth in the western United States, those models suggest strong shaking in the immediate epicentral area, moderate shaking at distances of 30 to 50 kilometers, and felt but not damaging shaking out to perhaps 100 kilometers in favorable conditions. The April 13th event was felt at considerably greater distances than that. Reports from the Sacramento Valley represent ground that is 200 kilometers or more from the epicenter, across the barrier of the Sierra Nevada mountain range. That range of felt reports is not impossible, but it is notably larger than the median expectation for this magnitude and depth. Several physical mechanisms can explain this, and they are not mutually exclusive. The basin and range crust of western Nevada has specific properties that enhance the propagation of certain types of seismic waves over long distances. The region's thin, extended crust acts as an efficient waveguide for what seismologists call LG waves, regional surface waves that travel along the crust rather than through the deeper mantle. The basin and range geology, with its alternating valleys and mountain blocks, amplifies this effect. Energy that would be absorbed or scattered in thicker, more homogeneous continental crust travels farther here, which is why Nevada earthquakes routinely have felt footprints that seem outsized for their magnitude when you compare them naively to events in the central United States or the Appalachian region. The shallow hypercenter adds to this. When a rupture occurs close to the surface, the seismic energy converts more efficiently into surface waves, which travel farther and shake the ground more persistently than the body waves that dominate energy release from deeper earthquakes. A magnitude 5.7 at 7 kilometers depth produces significantly more surface shaking than the same magnitude at 30 kilometers. The April 13th event was shallow enough to hit this efficiency threshold, and the combination of shallow depth and basin and range crustal propagation produced a felt area that extends well beyond what a simple magnitude lookup would predict. The deeper scientific question is about the rupture geometry itself. In the immediate aftermath of a significant earthquake, seismologists attempt to determine the fault plane solution, essentially, which direction the fault was oriented, how it was dipping, and which direction the two sides of the fault slid relative to each other. For a simple, clean rupture on a single fault, this analysis is relatively straightforward. The waveforms from different directions carry predictable patterns of compression and tension that allow the fault orientation to be determined. For complex ruptures on multiple fault strands, or at fault junctions where different structural orientations intersect, the analysis becomes much more difficult. The April 13th waveform data showed characteristics consistent with a complex rupture, the kind of signature you get from a system that is not breaking along a single clean plane, but activating across multiple structures with different orientations simultaneously. This is consistent with what the Walker Lane is. The system's fault strands include both northwest trending strike-slip faults and more northerly trending normal faults, and in many places these structures intersect or run closely parallel to each other, creating zones where the stress field is complicated and where ruptures can switch between fault orientations mid-event. Whether the April 13th rupture involved that kind of geometric complexity is something that the full finite fault solution, which requires more data and more processing time than the immediate post-event analysis, will eventually clarify. But the early indicators are consistent with Walker Lane behavior, distributed, geometrically complex, involving more than one structural element, not a line crack in the crust, a fractured volume releasing stress across a zone. What the data does not show is any indication of a tsunami hazard. This is a continental crustal event, not an offshore subduction rupture, and the Great Basin is not an ocean. But the absence of that particular secondary hazard does not reduce the significance of what the data does show, which is a shallow, complex, possibly multi-fault rupture in a region that is capable of producing earthquakes an order of magnitude larger. The magnitude 5.7 of April 13th is not the upper bound of what the Walker Lane can do. Not even close. And the history of this system, which we are about to walk through, makes that point in the clearest possible terms. Part 5. What the Walker Lane actually is. Imagine taking the San Andreas Fault, one of the most famous tectonic structures on Earth, a single clean line of crustal failure running from the Salton Sea in the south to Cape Mendocino in the north, and instead of that single clean line, smearing it across a 100-kilometre wide band of terrain. Not one fault, but dozens. Not one identifiable boundary, but a zone of distributed deformation where the crust has been pulled, sheared, stretched, and fractured over millions of years into a complex network of intersecting and sub-parallel fault strands. Some of those strands are long and well mapped, others are short and poorly characterized. Some run northwest to southeast in strike-slip mode, with the two sides grinding horizontally past each other. Others run roughly north-south in normal fault mode, with the crust pulling apart and one side dropping relative to the other. Many places in the Walker Lane feature both types of faulting operating simultaneously, creating what geologists call a transtensional environment, a combination of a lateral shearing and crustal extension that produces distinctive geological signatures and complicated seismic behavior. That is the Walker Lane. And it extends from the area east of the Sierra Nevada in Owens Valley in the south, northward through the basin and range terrain of Nevada, covering a swath of terrain that includes the Reno-Carson City metropolitan area, the growing communities along the Interstate 80 corridor, and the agricultural and small-town communities of the Lahontan Valley, including Fallon, the site of a naval air station that probably has earthquake plans, and Silver Springs, the small community near the April 13th epicenter that probably does not. The tectonic context for the Walker Lane requires understanding something that is counterintuitive to most people who learned their plate tectonics from a simplified diagram. The standard model shows the San Andreas Fault as the boundary between the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate, a clean line where one plate slides northwest relative to the other. That model is correct as far as it goes, but it is incomplete. The San Andreas absorbs approximately 75 to 80% of the total motion between the Pacific and North American plates. The remaining 20 to 25% has to go somewhere else, and a significant portion of it goes into the Walker Lane. Global Positioning System measurements, the network of GPS stations that allows geologists to measure the movement of the ground surface at millimeter-per-year precision, confirm this directly. Stations in the Walker Lane show measurable motion toward the northwest relative to stable North America, consistent with the Walker Lane absorbing a share of the Pacific North American plate motion that the San Andreas does not fully accommodate. The measurements show gradients, different stations moving at slightly different rates, with the total motion distributed across the width of the deformation belt rather than concentrated at a single boundary. That distributed GPS signal is the surface expression of the Walker Lane's fundamental character as a diffuse, wide, complicated plate boundary system rather than a sharp line. What makes this particularly interesting from a geological perspective is that the Walker Lane appears to be growing its share of the total plate motion over geological time. The evidence for this comes from multiple directions. Geodetic measurements show current motion. Geological mapping shows the cumulative offset on Walker Lane fault strands over millions of years. Paleoseismic investigations trenching across faults to study the sedimentary record of past earthquakes show repeated large ruptures over the Quaternary period. Taken together, these lines of evidence suggest that the Walker Lane is not a static feature. It is an evolving boundary. The relative importance of the Walker Lane versus the San Andreas in accommodating Pacific North American plate motion has apparently been shifting over geological time, with the Walker Lane increasingly taking on more of the load. Some geologists have taken this reasoning to its logical conclusion and proposed that the Walker Lane may represent the early stages of a future plate boundary reorganization, a new tectonic boundary forming in slow motion across the interior of the western United States. We will come back to that idea, because it has profound implications for how we think about long-term seismic hazard in this region. But for now, the immediate point is this. The April 13th earthquake occurred in a system that is actively accommodating a significant fraction of two-plate motion, in a region where that motion is distributed across a complex fault network rather than concentrated on a single identifiable boundary. This is not a local Nevada story. It is a plate tectonic story that happens to be playing out beneath one of the fastest growing urban corridors in the American West. The structural complexity of the Walker Lane, the fact that it is a braided, distributed system rather than a single fault, has direct consequences for how hazard models handle it. The standard approach to earthquake hazard modelling involves identifying individual fault sources, characterising their geometry and slip rates from geological and geodetic data, estimating their maximum magnitude and recurrence interval from paleoseismic evidence, and then propagating the resulting ground motion through site-specific amplification models to produce maps of expected shaking. This approach works reasonably well for simple, well-characterised fault systems. For the Walker Lane, the approach faces a fundamental data limitation. Many of the individual fault strands within the system are not well enough characterised to serve as reliable inputs to the model. The geometry is uncertain, the slip rates are poorly constrained, the paleoseismic record is incomplete, and because some of the faults within the zone may be short, interconnected and capable of triggering each other, the relationship between individual fault sources and the total system hazard is not straightforward. The result is that Walker Lane hazard estimates, even in the best available models, carry larger uncertainties than estimates for better characterised fault systems. That uncertainty does not mean the hazard is lower, it means we know less about what form it will take when it next manifests at full scale. Part 6. The Hidden Plate Boundary Shift. Something is happening to the tectonic geography of the western United States that operates on a timescale no human has ever witnessed directly, but that geologists can read in the rock record and confirm with modern geodetic measurements. The plate boundary is moving eastward, not in a sudden, dramatic way, not on any timescale a human civilization would notice. But over millions of years, the locus of the greatest concentration of plate motion between the Pacific and North American plates has been migrating away from the coast and into the interior. The San Andreas system, which currently absorbs most of the motion, has a geological history going back roughly 30 million years, and it has not always been where it is today. The faults that make up the San Andreas system have evolved, shifted and reorganised over that span, and the evidence in the landscape of the Great Basin, the extended, faulted, stretched crust of Nevada and adjacent states, suggests that some of that motion has been gradually transferred inland into the Walker Lane and the broader basin and range system. GPS measurements are now precise enough to capture this in real time. The total Pacific North American relative motion, measured by global geodetic networks, is well constrained at approximately 50 mm per year across the boundary. Of that, roughly 35 to 40 mm per year is absorbed by the San Andreas system. Roughly 10 to 12 mm per year goes into the Walker Lane. The remainder is distributed across other structures in the Great Basin. These numbers have been stable enough over the measurement period to serve as reliable constraints, but they are not permanent features of Earth's tectonic architecture. They are a snapshot of a system that has been evolving for tens of millions of years and will continue to evolve. The April 13th earthquake, 5.7, shallow, felt across a wide corridor in western Nevada, is one data point in that ongoing story. The rupture released stress that had been accumulating on one or more Walker Lane fault strands as the Pacific Plate continued its inexorable northwestward motion relative to North America. The energy budget for that accumulation is ongoing. The slip that occurred on April 13th did not stop the plates from moving. It accommodated a small amount of the total slip that must eventually occur, and then the accumulation of strain resumed. The Walker Lane will keep loading. It has no choice. The plates are moving, and the Walker Lane is one of the places where that motion must be released. The longer-term picture, the one that plays out over millions of years rather than decades or centuries, raises a genuinely fascinating and slightly unsettling possibility. If the Walker Lane continues to absorb a growing share of the total plate motion, and if the geological trend toward inland plate boundary migration continues, then the region we now call the Walker Lane may eventually become the dominant plate boundary between the Pacific and North American plates. The San Andreas may fade in relative importance as the Walker Lane grows. The current plate boundary geography of the western United States, with California bearing the primary seismic burden of plate interaction, may be a transitional state, not a permanent one. Whether that transition takes another 10 million years or 50 million years is something no one can specify with confidence. But the April 13th earthquake is, in this long-term context not just a moderate Nevada event. It is a tremor from a system that may be in the process of becoming the most significant tectonic boundary on the North American continent. Part 7. Why Nevada is geologically misunderstood. The image most people carry of Nevada is one of extremes: Las Vegas neon, and the vast silence of the high desert, casino floors and empty salt flats. A state that is either a city or nothing. What it is not in the popular imagination is seismically dangerous. Nevada feels stable in the cultural geography of American hazards. It is not on the coast. It is not near a volcanic arc. It does not have a hurricane season. It seems, from the outside, like a place where the dramatic natural events happen elsewhere. This perception is wrong in one specific and important way. Nevada ranks third in the United States for seismic hazard, behind Alaska, which sits above a major subduction zone, behind California, home of the San Andreas, but ahead of every other state in the lower 48. The USGS National Seismic Hazard Maps show that the probability of experiencing strong ground shaking in the Reno-Carson City corridor over a 50-year period is comparable to parts of Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay Area. This is not a minor footnote. This is a fundamental characteristic of the region's geology that has enormous implications for the people who live and build there. The growth of the Reno metropolitan area over the past 2 decades has been substantial. Tesla's Gigafactory sits east of Reno, in the middle of the Walker Lane deformation zone. Major data centers, distribution warehouses, and industrial facilities have been built throughout the region. Residential development has expanded outward from the city core into areas where the fault risk is not prominently communicated. The infrastructure serving these communities, highways, bridges, water systems, electrical transmission, was largely built during a period when Nevada's seismic risk was not understood at the level of detail that modern hazard models now provide, and when building codes in Nevada were less stringent than in neighbouring California. The April 13th earthquake did not destroy any of this infrastructure, but it demonstrated, with real shaking felt across a wide region, that the system capable of producing ground motion strong enough to stress that infrastructure is alive and active. What the Walker Lane can do at magnitude 5.7 is not what it can do at magnitude 7.2, and magnitude 7.2 is not hypothetical in this system, it is historical. Part 8. The fault system that refuses to behave normally. Here is where the Walker Lane becomes genuinely complicated in ways that matter for understanding what April 13th might or might not mean for the near future. Most fault systems, when they rupture, follow a predictable script. A section of fault that has been locked, held together by friction while the tectonic plates on either side continue moving, eventually accumulates enough strain to overcome that friction. The fault breaks along that locked section, releasing the accumulated strain as an earthquake. After the earthquake, the fault may experience aftershocks as the crust around the rupture zone adjusts to its new stress state. Then the fault goes back to being locked, starts accumulating strain again, and waits for the next rupture. This cycle, load, rupture, relax, repeat, is the foundation of most seismic hazard modelling, and it works reasonably well for simple fault systems with well-defined locked sections and predictable recurrence intervals. The Walker Lane does not do this cleanly. It does something considerably more complicated and considerably more difficult to model. The fault network that makes up the Walker Lane is interconnected in ways that allow stress changes from one fault strand to cascade through the system and affect the behaviour of other fault strands. When one fault releases stress through an earthquake, it changes the stress state of the surrounding crust. In favourable geometries, a rupture on one fault can actually increase the stress on adjacent faults, pushing them closer to failure rather than simply relaxing the regional stress field. This phenomenon, called Coulomb stress transfer, is well documented in seismology and has been invoked to explain numerous instances of earthquake sequences where ruptures on one fault appeared to trigger ruptures on nearby faults within hours, days, or weeks. In a system as geometrically complex as the Walker Lane, where multiple fault strands with different orientations run through the same volume of crust, the potential for Coulomb stress transfer effects is high. The history of the Walker Lane includes sequences where this is exactly what appears to have happened, where a large earthquake on one fault strand was followed, sometimes within minutes, by a large earthquake on an adjacent strand as the stress pulse from the first event pushed the second fault over its failure threshold. The classic and most dramatic example of this in the Walker Lane's modern record happened in 1954, and it is a sequence that anyone who lives in western Nevada should know about, even though almost none do. On December 16, 1954, a magnitude 7.1 earthquake ruptured the Fairview Peak Fault in central Nevada. It was one of the largest earthquakes in the United States in the 20th century, producing spectacular surface rupture and massive ground displacement across the desert. And then, approximately 4 minutes later, a second major earthquake, magnitude 7.0, ruptured the Dixie Valley Fault, roughly 40 kilometers to the northeast. Two earthquakes, each approximately magnitude 7, 4 minutes apart, on different fault strands in the same regional system. The Fairview Peak rupture altered the stress field around it in exactly the geometry needed to bring the Dixie Valley Fault to failure. 4 minutes was all it took. The Walker Lane, in December of 1954, demonstrated in real time that it is not a collection of independent faults operating in isolation. It is a networked mechanical system capable of producing chain reaction ruptures that amplify the total energy release far beyond what any single fault strand would produce alone. The April 13th magnitude 5.7 occurred in a different part of the Walker Lane, the Reno Silver Springs corridor rather than the central Nevada basin. But the structural principle is the same. The fault strands in this part of the system are interconnected, geometrically proximate, and subject to the same Coulomb stress transfer dynamics that produced the 1954 sequence. Whether the April 13th event has moved any adjacent structures meaningfully closer to failure is something the aftershock monitoring data and stress modelling in the following weeks will help clarify. Whether the stress redistribution was significant enough to elevate the probability of a follow-on event is an open question that no one can honestly answer with certainty in the immediate aftermath of the main shock. But the question is not academic. It is the right question to be asking about a system that has already proven, in the geological record and in the historical record, that it knows how to chain. Part 9. The 1915 to 1954 Nevada Mega Rupture Era. If you want to understand what the Walker Lane is actually capable of, you need to know the history, not the ancient geological record, though that tells a story too. The relatively recent historical record, the earthquakes that occurred within living memory or close to it, in a region where the population was sparse enough that the events registered primarily as scientific curiosities rather than human catastrophes. Because this history defines the envelope of what this system has done in the recent past, and what it can therefore do again. The sequence begins in 1915. On October 2, 1915, a magnitude 7.2 earthquake struck the Pleasant Valley region of central Nevada, a broad, flat basin bordered by steep, fault-bounded mountain ranges, roughly in the geographic center of the state. The Pleasant Valley earthquake produced over 60 kilometers of surface rupture, with fault scarps several meters high appearing along the basin-bounding range front fault in a matter of seconds. The desert landscape of central Nevada was effectively torn open in a straight line for 60 kilometers. Because the region was virtually uninhabited, the human toll was minimal. The seismological significance was enormous. The Pleasant Valley earthquake confirmed that the Great Basin of Nevada was capable of producing great earthquakes, not the magnitude 5s and 6s of ordinary seismicity, but the magnitude 7s that reshape landscapes and destroy cities when they occur near population centers. 17 years later, on December 21, 1932, a magnitude 7.1 earthquake struck the Cedar Mountain area of central Nevada, roughly 100 kilometers south of the Pleasant Valley rupture. Again surface rupture, again large ground displacement, again in a region sparse enough in population that the immediate human consequences were limited, but the geological and seismological significance was substantial. 2 magnitude 7+ earthquakes in Nevada's Great Basin, separated by 17 years, in a region that the popular imagination does not associate with major earthquake activity. The Walker Lane was loading and releasing stress at the magnitude 7 scale throughout the first half of the 20th century, with essentially no public awareness. Then came 1954. By any measure, 1954 was a remarkable year for seismicity in the Walker Lane. Before the December Fairview Peak and Dixie Valley double rupture, There had already been significant seismic activity in the region during that calendar year, including a magnitude 6.6 event in July. But December 16th, 1954, delivered the Walker Lane's most dramatic recent demonstration of its capacity for large, interconnected rupture sequences. The Fairview Peak magnitude 7.1, followed 4 minutes later by the Dixie Valley magnitude 7.0, produced two major earthquakes in the same tectonic system within the span of a single news cycle. The total energy release from those two events in 4 minutes exceeded what a single magnitude 7.3 earthquake would release. The stress transfer from Fairview Peak to Dixie Valley was not subtle. It was large enough, and fast enough, to bring a major fault to failure almost immediately after the neighbouring fault broke. If you are counting, that is 4 earthquakes of magnitude 7 or greater in the Walker Lane system between 1915 and 1954, a 39-year window. That is roughly one major earthquake per decade in a region that, at the time of those earthquakes, had almost no infrastructure and almost no population. The physics that produced those earthquakes has not changed. The fault strands that hosted them are still there. The stress is accumulating again, and the region through which the Walker Lane runs, particularly its northern section, through the Reno-Carson City corridor, is no longer sparsely populated desert. It is a metropolitan area of several 100,000 people, with the associated infrastructure of highways, utilities, hospitals, schools, and industrial facilities that a modern urban centre requires. 4 magnitude 7 earthquakes in 39 years. Nevada, 3rd in US seismic hazard. Walker Lane, 100 kilometers wide, carrying 20 to 25% of Pacific North American plate motion. Reno and Carson City, sitting directly in the deformation zone. These are not separate facts that need to be synthesized into a concerning picture. They are the same fact stated from different angles, pointing at the same reality. The April 13th magnitude 5.7 is the latest data point in a long series, and the long series says that this system is not done. Part 10. The 4-minute earthquake chain reaction. Let us slow down on the 1954 sequence for a moment, because the mechanism it demonstrated, fault-to-fault triggering via Coulomb stress transfer, is directly relevant to interpreting what April 13th might mean for the Walker Lane going forward. When the Fairview Peak fault ruptured on December 16, 1954, it released a massive amount of accumulated strain along a segment of crust that had been locked for a long time. That release was not just a local event. The energy released by the rupture propagated outward through the surrounding crust as seismic waves, and it also changed the static stress field around the rupture, the permanent, quasi-static redistribution of stress in the crust that persists after the seismic waves have passed. In certain geometries, this static stress change increases the stress on nearby fault segments. The technical term is positive Coulomb failure stress change, a region of crust where the stress has been pushed in the direction of failure rather than away from it. The Dixie Valley fault, sitting roughly 40 kilometers northeast of the Fairview Peak rupture zone, happened to be in a region where the Coulomb stress change from the Fairview Peak event was positive. How positive? Positive enough to bring the Dixie Valley fault, which presumably had already been accumulating its own strain through years of tectonic loading, over its failure threshold. The result was a magnitude 7 earthquake 4 minutes after the Fairview Peak rupture. Not a coincidence, not an unrelated event. A direct mechanical consequence of the first rupture, propagated through the crust at roughly the speed of seismic waves. The 4-minute gap between Fairview Peak and Dixie Valley is, in geological and seismological terms, essentially instantaneous. From the perspective of a seismologist trying to characterize the sequence in real time, it would have been challenging even with modern instrumentation to fully separate the two events in the initial minutes. With 1954 instrumentation, sparse networks, analog recordings, no digital signal processing, the complexity of what had just happened was not fully appreciated until scientists had time to study the records carefully. In 2026, with a dense network of modern seismometers covering the region, real-time GPS, and sophisticated automated earthquake detection algorithms, the monitoring capability is dramatically better. Whether it is good enough to detect the early warning signs of a comparable cascade before it happens, rather than after, is a more complicated question. What the Fairview Peak and Dixie Valley sequence demonstrates in terms that remain directly applicable to the April 13th Walker Lane rupture, is this. In a geometrically complex, interconnected fault system, the stress change from one earthquake can be the proximate cause of the next one. The magnitude 5.7 of April 13th changed the stress field in the surrounding Walker Lane crust. By how much, in what direction, and with what implications for specific neighbouring fault strands? These are the questions that seismologists are working through in the weeks following the event. The answers will not come immediately, and they will carry uncertainty. But the Fairview Peak and Dixie Valley precedent establishes clearly that the system we are dealing with is one where these effects are not merely theoretical. They are historical, they happened here, and the faults are still here. Part 11. Why these events matter today. The earthquakes of 1915, 1932 and 1954 are not just historical footnotes. They are the primary calibration events for modern seismic hazard assessments of the Walker Lane, and they carry a complication that makes those assessments inherently uncertain in ways that matter for how we plan around the hazard. The problem is instrumentation. In 1915, when Pleasant Valley ruptured at magnitude 7.2, the global seismograph network was sparse and primitive. The basic magnitude scale that we use today was not yet developed. Charles Richter would not publish his magnitude scale until 1935. The 1915 earthquake was recorded on some instruments, and scientists later estimated its magnitude from the available data, but the precision of that estimate is considerably lower than what we can achieve for earthquakes recorded by modern networks. Similarly, the spatial distribution of aftershocks, the precise location of the rupture along the fault plane, the directivity of the rupture, the detailed stress drop, all of the parameters that go into modern hazard models are poorly constrained for the 1915 event compared to what we would know about the same earthquake if it happened today. This matters because the hazard model for the Walker Lane depends critically on knowing not just that magnitude 7+ earthquakes have occurred, but where they occurred, on which specific fault strands, with what geometry, and with what implications for the remaining unruptured sections of the system. If the 1915 Pleasant Valley earthquake ruptured 60 kilometers of a fault strand that is 100 kilometers long, then there are 40 kilometers of that fault strand that have not yet ruptured in the recent historical period, 40 kilometers that may be accumulating strain and approaching failure. But if the mapping of the rupture zone is uncertain, then the identification of the unlocked versus locked portions of the fault is also uncertain. The hazard is real, but its spatial distribution is blurred by the limitation of the historical record. GPS geodesy has partially addressed this problem for the present day. The dense network of GPS stations across the Walker Lane now provides a continuous, high-precision record of how the ground surface is moving and departures from uniform motion, places where the GPS velocities show lower rates than nearby stations, suggesting that the crust is locked on a fault below and strain is accumulating, can be identified and used to flag potentially dangerous fault sections. This is genuinely powerful. But GPS covers the last 3 decades, not the centuries to millennia needed to fully characterize the recurrence interval of major faults. And in a distributed system like the Walker Lane, where strain can be partitioned between mapped and unmapped fault strands in ways that are not always visible at the surface, even the GPS record has gaps. The honest summary of the Walker Lane hazard situation in the wake of April 13th is this. We know the system is active. We know it is capable of magnitude 7 and above earthquakes based on historical evidence. We know it is carrying a large fraction of Pacific North American plate motion that must eventually be released, and we do not have a complete map of the individual fault strands through which that release will occur. The April 13th magnitude 5.7 is not the earthquake that resolves this uncertainty. It is a stress release event in a system whose total energy budget is much larger than a magnitude 5.7 represents. The uncertainty about where the next large rupture in this system will occur, and when, has not been meaningfully reduced by the April 13th event. If anything, the aftershock sequence and the stress redistribution it implies may have loaded certain adjacent structures to slightly higher levels than they were at before April 13th. Whether those elevated stress levels are significant is something the monitoring data will help answer. Whether they are significant enough to change the short-term rupture probability on any specific fault strand is not yet known. Part 12. The silent build-up problem. There is a particular kind of scientific unease that comes from knowing something is loading without knowing where it will unload. It is the feeling of a system with known inputs and unknown outputs. The Walker Lane is exactly this kind of system. The inputs are well constrained. The Pacific Plate is moving northwest relative to the North American Plate at approximately 50 millimeters per year across the full plate boundary. Of that motion, approximately 10 to 12 millimeters per year is being accommodated within the Walker Lane deformation belt, distributed across its various fault strands. This is not a guess or an inference, it is a measurement, repeated year after year by the GPS network, and it is stable. 10 to 12 millimeters per year going into the Walker Lane, every year, continuously, as the plates grind past each other. The outputs, meaning the earthquakes that release the accumulated strain, are not well constrained. We know the system has released magnitude 7+ events in the historical period. We know from paleoseismic investigations that large earthquakes have occurred repeatedly in the prehistoric record on many of the major Walker Lane fault strands. We know that the system has the total slip budget to produce large earthquakes on a recurrence interval of centuries to millennia on individual faults. But we do not know which fault strand is closest to failure right now. We do not know whether the strain accumulation is uniform across the system or concentrated in specific locked sections. We do not know whether some fault strands are releasing strain aseismically, through slow, quiet creep that never produces a felt earthquake, but still accommodates plate motion, or whether they are fully locked and saving up energy for a future large rupture. The GPS measurements help with this, but imperfectly. A fully locked fault section will show up in the GPS data as a zone of lower horizontal velocity gradient. The ground surface on either side of the fault is not slipping smoothly past each other, so there is a relative velocity deficit that builds up over time and can be detected by comparing GPS station velocities across the fault zone. But detecting this requires GPS stations close enough to the fault, on both sides, with long enough measurement histories to distinguish the locking signal from the noise in the geodetic data. For the best characterized faults in the Walker Lane, this analysis has been done, and it gives useful constraints. For the poorly characterized faults, the ones with limited geodetic coverage, the ones whose surface expression is unclear, the ones that may be entirely unmapped, the locking state is essentially unknown. This is the silent build-up problem. The Walker Lane is loading. We can measure the total loading rate. We cannot fully map where that load is being stored. We cannot identify the specific fault strands that are most critically stressed at this moment. We cannot tell you which segment of this system is going to rupture next, or when, or at what magnitude. This is not a failure of the science. It is an honest acknowledgement of the limits of what geodesy and seismology can currently tell us about a complex distributed fault system in a region with imperfect spatial coverage. The April 13th earthquake moved the system. It changed the stress field. It produced an aftershock sequence that is giving us new information about where the active structures are in the Silver Springs corridor. But it did not solve the overall mapping problem. The Walker Lane still has more unknown stress distribution than known. The blind spots are real, and they are large. Part 13. The Wide Felt Zone Problem. Let us come back to something that the April 13th event demonstrated directly, and that deserves more attention than it has received in the coverage of this earthquake. The shaking was felt in Sacramento, in Modesto, in Grass Valley, in Davis. These are communities in California's Central Valley and foothills, on the other side of the Sierra Nevada from the epicenter, separated from Silver Springs by one of the most topographically dramatic mountain ranges in the contiguous United States. And yet people there felt the ground move. The Sierra Nevada is not, it turns out, an effective barrier to seismic energy. The mountain range is topographically impressive, peaks exceeding 4,000 meters, granite walls that rise thousands of feet above the adjacent valleys, but topography is not the same as seismic energy attenuation. Seismic waves travel through the rock, not over it, and the specific rock types and crustal structure of the Sierra Nevada are actually relatively efficient at transmitting certain wave types over long distances. The Sierran crust is thick and cold, with high seismic velocities that allow waves to travel efficiently without the scattering and absorption that would occur in warmer, more ductile lower crust. The basin and range crust to the east of the Sierra Nevada, the crust that the Walker Lane is embedded in, has different properties. It is thinner, more extended, more heterogeneous, and characterized by alternating fast and slow velocity layers that create the waveguide effect for regional seismic waves. When an earthquake occurs in the Walker Lane, the energy radiates outward in all directions. Some of that energy travels west into the Sierra Nevada, where it propagates through the Sierran crust with moderate efficiency. When it reaches the western side of the Sierra Nevada and encounters the softer sedimentary basin fill of the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys, it can be amplified. The slow, unconsolidated sediments of the valley floor act as resonators for seismic waves, causing them to shake at higher amplitudes and for longer durations than the underlying bedrock would. The result is felt shaking at distances that might seem surprising for the magnitude of the source event. This has direct implications for hazard assessment in the California Central Valley. The conventional way of thinking about valley communities like Sacramento, Modesto, and Fresno in terms of earthquake risk focuses on their distance from the San Andreas Fault and other California fault systems. They are east of the Coast Ranges, in the interior of the state, apparently removed from the active fault structures that dominate California's seismic hazard. What the April 13th event reminds us is that the Walker Lane, which runs through Nevada, can generate ground motion that is felt in these valley communities because of the specific geometry of the crustal waveguide and the amplification properties of the valley sediments. For a moderate magnitude 5.7, the effect is felt but not damaging. For a Walker Lane magnitude 7 or above, which the historical record says is possible, the implications for felt area and potential damage extent in valley communities would be considerably different. The wide felt footprint of the April 13th event is not a curiosity or an anomaly. It is a demonstration of how efficiently the Walker Lane system can transmit seismic energy westward into the California interior, and it is a data point that should inform how both Nevada and California communities think about their exposure to this fault system. The Walker Lane is not just Nevada's problem. It is a regional hazard whose effects extend across state lines into communities that may not be thinking about it at all. Part 14. The stress redistribution question. In the days following the April 13th main shock, the aftershock sequence continued to evolve in ways that seismologists monitoring the data found both informative and, in a few respects, worth watching carefully. The spatial pattern of aftershocks, elongated along the northeast to southwest structural trend of the Walker Lane, with some apparent clustering suggesting multiple fault strands contributing to the sequence, remained consistent with what a complex, multi-fault Walker Lane activation event would look like. The temporal pattern showed the expected general decay in frequency, but with enough irregularity in the decay rate to keep the monitoring picture from being immediately clean and straightforward. The question that underpins all of this monitoring work is whether the Walker Lane system is rebalancing itself around the April 13th rupture, essentially settling into a new equilibrium where the crust accommodates the stress change from the main shock through distributed aftershock activity and then gradually stabilizes, or whether it is in the early stages of a more extended sequence that could include larger events on adjacent fault strands. This is not a question that can be definitively answered in the days immediately following the main shock. Seismological practice has developed statistical tools for assessing this, models that use the early aftershock sequence to estimate probabilities for various possible future outcomes, including the probability that the sequence will escalate into something larger. But all of these probabilistic assessments carry wide uncertainty bounds in the early period, because the key distinction between a routine aftershock sequence and a foreshock main shock aftershock sequence involving a larger event often only becomes clear in retrospect. What is clear from the stress redistribution perspective is that the April 13th rupture changed the stress state of the Walker Lane crust in its vicinity. The specific geometry of that change, which nearby fault strands saw their Coulomb failure stress increase, and by how much, can be modelled using the inferred fault plane solution and rupture parameters from the main shock. These models are being developed by the seismological community as of the days following the event, and they will eventually provide a detailed picture of which portions of the Walker Lane were stressed closer to failure by the April 13th rupture. Whether any of those portions are close enough to failure to represent an elevated short-term rupture probability is something the models will attempt to quantify, with appropriate uncertainty. The fundamental point, which connects directly to the Walker Lane's character as a networked fault system rather than an isolated structure, is that the April 13th earthquake did not happen in isolation. It happened in a system. The system responded with aftershocks distributed across multiple fault strands, with stress redistribution across a wide area of the Walker Lane deformation belt. The crust of western Nevada is not static. It is actively adjusting to the energy release of April 13th in a process that will play out over days to weeks before it truly stabilizes. And it is doing so in a system that, by historical record and by the physics of its fault geometry, is capable of producing additional large events in the same corridor on timescales ranging from minutes to decades. Part 15. Foreshock Probability Window. Here is the uncomfortable truth that seismologists have to communicate every time a moderate earthquake occurs in a region capable of much larger events. At the moment of occurrence, you cannot know with certainty whether what just happened is a main shock, the largest event in a sequence that will now decay in frequency and magnitude over time, or a foreshock, meaning a preliminary event that happens to precede a larger rupture. This is not a limitation of current seismology that better instruments or better algorithms will eventually solve. It is a fundamental feature of how earthquake sequences work, rooted in the fact that the physical process that produces a main shock is identical to the physical process that produces a foreshock. The crust breaks when stress exceeds strength. Whether that break is the largest event in the sequence or not depends on factors: the spatial distribution of stress, the geometry of the fault network, the strength heterogeneity of the crust that cannot be directly observed in real time. Statistical baselines exist for this problem. For any given earthquake, the probability that it will be reclassified as a foreshock based on the occurrence of a subsequent larger event within a specific space and time window has been estimated from historical earthquake catalogues. For a magnitude 5.7 in the western United States, in a seismically active region, that probability is somewhere in the range of 5 to 10% over the following 30 days. That means, in round numbers, that roughly 9 times out of 10, a magnitude 5.7 turns out to be the main shock of its sequence. 1 time out of 10, give or take depending on the specific regional parameters, something larger follows. 1 in 10 is not alarming in isolation, but context matters. The Walker Lane is not average terrain. Its specific combination of high strain rate, complex fault geometry, documented capacity for multi-fault rupture sequences, and relatively limited paleoseismic characterization means that the uncertainty in that probability estimate is higher than it would be for a simpler, better characterized fault system. The 1 in 10 baseline is derived from earthquake catalogues that include events in all geological settings, some much simpler than the Walker Lane. For a distributed, interconnected fault system with a documented history of chain reaction rupture sequences, the relevant probability may not be exactly 1 in 10. Quantifying how much the Walker Lane's specific characteristics shift the baseline probability is precisely what the stress modelling and aftershock sequence analysis in the weeks following April 13th is trying to address. What the community of scientists monitoring this sequence will be watching for is specific seismological signatures that would elevate concern, migration of aftershock hypocenters toward a specific fault segment that is not yet in the aftershock cloud, increasing magnitude of individual aftershocks rather than the expected decreasing trend, or patterns in the waveform data consistent with aseismic slip-loading adjacent fault segments. None of these signatures were apparent in the immediate days following the main shock, but the monitoring window is weeks, not hours, and the Walker Lane's capacity to surprise, demonstrated by 1954 and by the geological record of episodic multifault rupture, means that dismissing the possibility of a more significant sequel event would be premature. Part 16. Competing interpretations and why they persist. Every significant earthquake produces a rapid proliferation of alternative explanations on social media and in certain corners of the internet. The April 13th Walker Lane magnitude 5.7 was no exception. Within hours of the main shock, claims began circulating that the event was caused by high-frequency, active auroral research antenna testing, by underground nuclear detonations, by directed energy weapons, or by other non-tectonic mechanisms whose proponents feel the scientific establishment is not honestly discussing. The straightforward seismological reality is that waveform data provides a direct fingerprint of the mechanism that produced an earthquake. A tectonic earthquake, a fault rupturing under tectonic stress, produces a characteristic pattern of compressional and tensional radiation in the seismic waves, a specific frequency content and waveform shape, and a spatial pattern of first motion polarities at seismograph stations around the epicenter that encodes the geometry of the rupture. An explosion, nuclear or otherwise, produces a fundamentally different waveform signature. Predominantly compressional motion in all directions, a different frequency spectrum, a different depth signature. The two cannot be confused by a seismologist looking at the data. The April 13th event produced a tectonic earthquake waveform in all respects. It looks like a Walker Lane fault rupture because that is what it is. The persistence of non-tectonic explanations for earthquakes is partly a product of the fact that the actual tectonic explanation for this particular earthquake involves a fault system that most people have never heard of. When the mainstream narrative offers Walker Lane deformation belt, transtensional crustal failure in a complex distributed fault network, and the alternative narrative offers a simpler, if more conspiratorial explanation, the communication gap that allows the alternative to gain traction is partly a failure of science communication and public education around the Walker Lane's existence and behaviour. The April 13th earthquake is exactly what the geology predicted for this region. It fits the Walker Lane's documented behaviour. It occurred where the strain accumulation measurement suggested stress was building. It is geology doing geology. The fringe theories are filling a space that better public understanding of the Walker Lane would occupy. Part 17. The real hazard map nobody mentions. Pull up the USGS National Seismic Hazard Map right now. Seriously, open a new tab, type it in, look at it. What you'll see is a colour-coded picture of earthquake risk across the United States, and for most people it confirms exactly what they expect. California blazes. The San Andreas system, the East Bay faults, the Southern California fault networks, all of it lights up in the deep reds and oranges that represent the highest probability of strong ground shaking over a 50-year window. The Pacific Northwest glows along the coast, exactly where Cascadia sits offshore, waiting. These are the places the map confirms, the places the public narrative already told you to be afraid of. But then there's something else on that map, something most people's eyes slide right past. There is a band of elevated hazard running through Nevada, not skirting the edges, not clipping a corner, running through it, cutting straight through the Reno-Carson City corridor, extending southward through the heart of central Nevada, bleeding into eastern California along a belt of terrain that has no famous name in the public vocabulary, no Hollywood disaster movie attached to it, no Pulitzer Prize-winning magazine article that burned it into collective memory. The colours on that map in this corridor are not mild. In parts of the Walker Lane belt, the hazard levels are comparable to, and in some zones exceed, significant portions of coastal California. Not almost as bad. Comparable, on the same map, in the same colour range. That is what the data says. And that gap between what the data says and what the public conversation reflects is one of the most consequential disconnects in American hazard communication right now. So let's talk about what is actually sitting inside that band on the map. Because this is not empty desert we're discussing. This is not a theoretical risk to sagebrush and jackrabbits. The Reno metropolitan area, roughly 400,000 people in the city and surrounding suburbs, sits directly inside the Walker Lane deformation zone. Not near it, not adjacent to it, inside it. And Reno's economic footprint has grown dramatically in the past decade. Tesla's gigafactory is out there, east of the city, right in the middle of the fault belt. Major data centres, distribution warehouses, industrial facilities that form a critical node in the supply chains of the American West. All of it built in a corridor that the USGS hazard map colours the same shade of Sirius as Los Angeles. Carson City, Nevada's state capital, home to major government facilities, a growing residential population, the administrative infrastructure of an entire state, is inside the Walker Lane deformation belt. Not nearby. Inside. Fallon. The Naval Air Station there hosts carrier aviation training. It is a significant military facility, the kind of installation that appears on lists of critical national infrastructure. It is in the zone. Fernley, Yerington. The communities scattered across the Lahontan Valley east of Reno, agricultural towns, small cities, the kind of places that don't make national news until something goes wrong. All of them sit within the system that ruptured on April 13th. All of them felt the ground move that night. None of them have the earthquake preparedness culture that their actual hazard level demands. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable in a very specific, very practical way. Nevada's building codes have not kept pace with its seismic reality. That's not an attack on Nevada's engineers or planners. Many of them know this, have been fighting to fix it for years. and are working against the inertia of decades of institutional underestimation. It's simply a description of how we got here. California's building standards are among the most sophisticated on the planet, and they got that way through a brutal process of learning from disasters. The 1971 Sylmar earthquake collapsed a hospital and killed patients in their beds, so California rewrote hospital construction standards. The 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake dropped highway overpasses onto moving traffic and killed people in their cars, so California rewrote highway overpass design. The 1994 Northridge earthquake exposed critical failures in steel frame buildings that engineers thought were safe, so California rewrote those standards too. Every major California earthquake produced political will, engineering revisions, and a construction culture that now treats seismic resilience as a baseline expectation rather than an optional upgrade. Nevada did not have that sequence. And here's the dark irony of why. The Walker Lane's most violent historical ruptures, the 1915 Pleasant Valley magnitude 7.2, the 1932 Cedar Mountain magnitude 7.1, the 1954 Fairview Peak and Dixie Valley double event, all occurred in terrain that was essentially uninhabited at the time. The fault system delivered magnitude 7 earthquakes to the Nevada desert repeatedly throughout the 20th century, and because there was almost nobody there to be killed, almost nothing there to be destroyed, the political pressure to respond never materialized. The Walker Lane was doing catastrophic things in a place where catastrophic things didn't cost anyone anything visible. So the lesson never got learned. The codes never got rewritten with the same urgency. The culture of preparedness never developed. And then people moved in. Nevada is one of the fastest growing states in the country. The growth in the Northern Corridor, Reno, Sparks, Carson City, Fernley, the communities along Interstate 80 east of the Sierra Nevada, has been significant and sustained. A large portion of that growth is people relocating from California, specifically from the Bay Area and Southern California, priced out of coastal markets and drawn by Nevada's space, affordability, and lack of state income tax. These are people who, in many cases, grew up in earthquake country, who know what a shake alert notification sounds like, who have go bags and know where their gas shutoff is, and they are moving from communities with sophisticated earthquake preparedness cultures into a region where the hazard is comparable and in some metrics worse, but the institutional response has not caught up. They are stepping off one fault system and onto another, and most of them don't know the new one's name. Here's what that means in concrete terms. The building stock in Reno, Carson City, and the surrounding communities was largely constructed during a period when Nevada's seismic risk was acknowledged in general terms, but not fully integrated into construction culture at the level the hazard actually demands. Unreinforced masonry buildings, the kind that kill people when they fall, still exist in these cities. Infrastructure built to standards that California revised after major disasters has not necessarily been revised here, because Nevada didn't have those disasters. Bridges, overpasses, water systems, the power grid, all of it was engineered in a context that underweighted the third-rank national seismic hazard that the USGS map has been showing for years. The April 13th magnitude 5.7 did not stress that infrastructure to failure. Buildings stood, bridges held, the lights stayed on, and that is good, genuinely good, but it is also potentially misleading, because the absence of failure at magnitude 5.7 does not tell you very much about performance at magnitude 7.2. Those are not the same earthquake. They are not even close to the same earthquake. The difference in energy release between a 5.7 and a 7.2 is not a matter of degree, it is a factor of roughly 500 in terms of seismic moment. What the Walker Lane did on April 13th is not a preview of what the Walker Lane is capable of, it is a fraction of it, a small fraction. And we know what the Walker Lane is capable of because it has already done it. 1915, 1932, 1954. 4 magnitude 7 or greater earthquakes in 111 years, in a corridor that at the time was nearly empty and is now home to hundreds of thousands of people, billions of dollars of infrastructure, military installations, data centers, and the economic engine of one of the fastest growing regions in the American West. The map has been telling this story for years. The data has been telling this story for years. The fault system itself has been telling this story in the rock record for millions of years. The only thing that has not kept pace is the public awareness. the collective recognition that the band of colour running through Nevada on the USGS hazard map represents the same category of risk that we have spent decades building institutions, codes and cultures around in California. April 13th was a reminder, a 5.7 reminder, which is the kind you can afford to learn from. The Walker Lane also sends magnitude 7.2 reminders. Those are considerably more expensive. And based on everything this system has told us about its own history, it is not finished sending them. Part 18. The Future Plate Boundary Hypothesis. Here is an idea that mainstream geology takes seriously. Not a fringe theory. Not something whispered at the edges of academic conferences by researchers who can't get their papers published. A hypothesis supported by multiple independent lines of evidence, discussed openly in peer-reviewed literature, and increasingly well supported by the geodetic data that GPS networks have been quietly accumulating for decades. The Walker Lane may be becoming the dominant plate boundary between the Pacific and North American plates. Let that sit for a second. Not the San Andreas, not the offshore subduction zones of the Pacific Northwest. The Walker Lane, the distributed 100-kilometre-wide fault belt running through the Nevada desert that most Americans have never heard of, may be in the early stages of replacing the San Andreas as the primary boundary between two of the largest tectonic plates on Earth. Now, before you close the tab, let me be very clear about the timescale we're talking about. This is not happening next year. It is not happening in your lifetime, or your children's lifetime, or the lifetime of any human civilization we can meaningfully imagine. We are talking about geological time. Millions of years, tens of millions of years. The kind of duration that makes the entire history of Homo sapiens, all 300,000 years of it, look like a rounding error. So this is not an imminent threat in any conventional sense of the word. But it is real. It is measurable. It is already happening right now in slow motion beneath our feet. And understanding it changes how you think about the Walker Lane's significance, not just as a regional hazard, but as one of the most consequential tectonic features on the North American continent. Here's the evidence. Start with what GPS is telling us right now. The total motion between the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate is approximately 50 millimeters per year, about 2 inches, the rate at which your fingernails grow. Of that total, the San Andreas system absorbs roughly 75 to 80%. The Walker Lane absorbs approximately 20 to 25%. The remainder is spread across other structures in the broader Basin and Range province. These numbers are not estimates or inferences. They are direct measurements, taken continuously by GPS stations that have been tracking ground surface motion at millimeter per year precision for decades. 20 to 25% sounds like a secondary role, and right now it is. But the geological record shows that this share has not always been what it is today, and there is no particular reason to believe it will stay where it is in the future. Go back 30 million years, the plate boundary geometry of the western United States looked fundamentally different. The San Andreas system, in its current form, did not yet exist. The boundary between the Pacific and North American plates was being accommodated by a different configuration of fault systems, and over the past 30 million years that configuration has reorganized multiple times in ways that shifted which structures were doing most of the work. The current setup, with the San Andreas dominant and the Walker Lane carrying a secondary share, is not the original arrangement. It is the current arrangement. And the geological evidence suggests it's not necessarily the final one either. Look at the terrain itself. The Basin and Range province, the extended, faulted, stretched crust that covers Nevada and adjacent parts of Utah, Arizona and California, is a product of the same long-term tectonic forces that are building the Walker Lane. The crust of the Great Basin has been stretched and thinned over tens of millions of years, pulled apart by the same regional stress field that drives deformation along the Walker Lane fault strands. The mountains and valleys of Nevada, the alternating ridges and basins that give the Basin and Range its name, are the surface expression of normal faulting, crust pulling apart, one block dropping relative to another in a pattern that repeats across the entire region. That stretching is not ancient history, it is ongoing. The crust of Nevada is still extending, still thinning, still deforming under a stress field that is intimately connected to the relative motion of the Pacific and North American plates. This is what a developing plate boundary looks like from the inside. Not a clean line, not a sudden rupture that reorganizes everything overnight. a gradual distributed process of crustal deformation that operates across a wide zone, accumulates over millions of years, and only becomes clearly legible as a plate boundary in retrospect, when geologists of the future look back at the rock record and say, yes, this is where the boundary was forming. We may be living inside that process right now. If the Walker Lane continues to absorb a growing share of the total plate motion, and there is geological reason to think the long-term trend points in that direction, then the future of the western United States involves a fundamental reorganization of its tectonic geography. The Sierra Nevada, currently a relatively stable crustal block that sits between the Walker Lane and the California coast, acting as a kind of buffer between the active fault belt and the Pacific, may eventually be incorporated into the deforming boundary zone. The line between active plate boundary and stable continental interior, which currently runs roughly along the eastern front of the Sierra Nevada, may migrate westward, or the entire region between the Walker Lane and the coast may become part of a wider, more complex boundary system. What that means, in its most extreme long-term projection, is that the geography of seismic risk in the American West may eventually look very different from what the USGS hazard map shows today. California's role as the primary earthquake frontier of the continent, the place where the plates interact most directly and most violently, may be a transitional feature rather than a permanent one. Nevada's role as the quieter interior may be similarly transitional. The boundary is moving, it has always been moving, and it is moving inland, again, millions of years, not your problem in any immediate practical sense. But here is why it matters for how we think about the Walker Lane today, in April 2026, in the aftermath of a magnitude 5.7 that most of the country has already forgotten. A fault system that is in the process of becoming a dominant plate boundary is not a fault system that is winding down. It is not a relic structure left over from some ancient tectonic configuration, slowly going quiet as the stress field moves elsewhere. It is a fault system that is, in geological terms, ascending. Taking on more load, becoming more central to the mechanics of how two major plates interact. The 10 to 12 millimeters per year that the Walker Lane is currently accommodating is not necessarily its steady-state share forever. It may be a minimum, a starting point on a trajectory that, given enough time, ends with the Walker Lane doing what the San Andreas does today. That trajectory has direct implications for the hazard picture in the near term, meaning decades and centuries, not millions of years. A fault system that is structurally increasing its importance in the plate boundary system is one that is likely to remain seismically active, to continue accumulating strain at its current or higher rates, and to produce large earthquakes on recurrence intervals consistent with its current strain budget. The Walker Lane is not going to go quiet. It is not going to stabilize into some lower activity regime that makes the historical record of magnitude 7 earthquakes irrelevant to the future. The plates are still moving. The Walker Lane is still taking its share, and its share may be growing. Every earthquake in the Walker Lane is a data point in this larger story. The magnitude 2 microseisms that rattle through the desert at 3 a.m. and never make any instrument readable to a human being. The magnitude 5.7 of April 13th, sharp and shallow and felt from Reno to Sacramento. The magnitude 7.2 of 1915, 60 kilometers of surface rupture appearing in the Nevada desert in a matter of seconds. All of them are the same process expressing itself at different scales. The Walker Lane accommodating its share of the motion between two plates that have been grinding past each other for tens of millions of years and will continue doing so for tens of millions more. The April 13th earthquake is, in this context, not a local Nevada story. It is not even primarily a hazard story, though it is absolutely that. It is a moment in a continental-scale tectonic reorganization that is unfolding in slow motion across the western edge of North America. The boundary is evolving. The Walker Lane is part of that evolution, and what ruptured on April 13th, in a shallow fault break beneath a desert corridor in western Nevada, is the same system that may one day be the most significant tectonic boundary on this continent. The plates do not care about our timescales. They do not care about our hazard maps, our building codes, our news cycles, or our tendency to only pay attention to fault systems that have already destroyed a famous city. They move at the rate they move. The Walker Lane takes its share. And on April 13th, in the span of a few seconds of ground shaking felt from Nevada to California, it reminded us, briefly, quietly, and with the particular patience of a system that operates on geological time. that it is here, it is active, and it is not finished. Part 19. The blind spot problem. The Walker lane has a visibility problem, and I don't mean that in a minor, easily fixed, just needs a better press release kind of way. I mean it in a deep, structural, operating at multiple levels simultaneously kind of way that makes the hazard harder to communicate, harder to plan around, and, in its most technically significant dimension, harder to even fully measure. Because the Walker lane isn't just invisible to the public. In important and genuinely unsettling ways, parts of it are invisible to science too. Let's take the layers one at a time. The first layer is public awareness, and this one, at least, has a straightforward explanation. California has spent decades building an earthquake culture, not because Californians are smarter or more forward-thinking than people in other states, but because the earthquakes kept coming and kept being expensive and kept killing people in ways that showed up on television. The 1971 Sylmar earthquake, the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, which interrupted a World Series game being broadcast live to tens of millions of people. The 1994 Northridge earthquake, which hit a major metropolitan area during morning rush hour and made the freeway collapse footage the most replayed news image of that year. Each one of those events created political will, insurance industry response, public education campaigns, and a generational memory of what earthquakes do to cities. California's earthquake culture is not a natural feature of the population. It was built, event by event, through repeated painful instruction. Nevada has not had that instruction. The Walker Lane's major historical ruptures, 1915, 1932, 1954, all occurred in terrain that was essentially empty. The desert swallowed those earthquakes without producing the kind of urban devastation that builds institutional memory. There were no collapsed freeway overpasses, no live television coverage of buildings coming down, no insurance industry reckoning that sent premiums spiking and brochures about earthquake preparedness into every mailbox in the state. The Walker Lane delivered magnitude 7 earthquakes to the Nevada desert for a century and received in return almost no cultural response. Because there was almost no one there to respond. Now there are hundreds of thousands of people there, and the cultural baseline for earthquake awareness in that community is calibrated to a hazard level that the actual geology does not support. The second layer is media framing, and this one is more insidious than it sounds, because media framing doesn't just reflect public awareness, it shapes it. The standard earthquake narrative in American journalism runs on 2 tracks, San Andreas and Cascadia. Those are the names that editors reach for, the names that headline writers know will resonate, the names that generate clicks because they live in the cultural vocabulary of risk. When a significant earthquake happens in California, the story writes itself, here is the fault, here is the history, here is the hazard. When a significant earthquake happens in Nevada, the story becomes a regional brief, a wire service item, a note in the science section, if it makes the science section at all. The Walker Lane, on April 13th, produced ground shaking felt from Nevada to Sacramento, and the national conversation moved on within hours, not because nothing happened, because the framework for recognizing it as a national story doesn't exist in the way that framework exists for California and the Pacific Northwest. This is not a conspiracy. It is not negligence exactly. It is the predictable output of a media ecosystem that covers earthquake risk through the lens of the names it already knows, and the Walker Lane is not one of those names. Until it produces the kind of urban catastrophe that California has periodically produced, it will continue to be reported as a local story. And the cruelty of that dynamic is that, by the time it produces that catastrophe, the window for the kind of preparedness that good public communication enables will have already closed. But here is the third layer, and this one keeps scientists up at night in a way that the first 2 don't, because the first 2 are communication problems. The third one is a knowledge problem, and knowledge problems are harder to fix. Many of the faults within the Walker Lane are incompletely mapped. Some are entirely unknown. Let me explain what that actually means in practice, because it is easy to hear incompletely mapped and think it's a minor technical caveat. It is not a minor technical caveat. It is a fundamental limitation in our ability to characterize the hazard that this system poses. The gold standard for understanding an individual fault's hazard is paleoseismic investigation. You find the fault. You dig a trench across it, sometimes multiple trenches, at multiple locations along the fault's length. You expose the layers of sediment that have accumulated over thousands of years. You look for the evidence of past earthquakes, the disrupted layers, the collapsed sediment, the fissure fills, and you date them using radiocarbon dating, luminescence dating, and other geochronological techniques. Done well, this process tells you when past large earthquakes occurred on that fault, how large they were based on the amount of offset, and therefore what the recurrence interval looks like. It gives you a quantitative hazard picture, not perfect, not precise enough to tell you when the next one will happen, but informative enough to feed into hazard models, building codes, land use decisions, and emergency preparedness planning. For the major, well-known faults of the Walker Lane, the ones with clear surface expression, long surface rupture histories, and enough scientific attention, this work has been done to varying degrees. The paleoseismic database for these faults is reasonably good, not as complete as scientists would like, not as spatially comprehensive as the region deserves, but it exists and it informs the current hazard models. For the secondary and tertiary fault strands, the shorter structures, the buried faults, the strands that haven't produced surface rupture in the recent geological past, but may be critically stressed right now, the paleoseismic record ranges from sparse to non-existent. These are faults that show up in geophysical data, faults whose existence can be inferred from the regional stress field, from subtle topographic signatures, from anomalies in gravity and magnetic surveys. Faults that are real, that are embedded in the same tectonic system as the well-characterized ones, and that may be accumulating strain just as steadily, but that have never been trenched, never been dated, never had their recurrence interval estimated, because the scientific resources needed to do that work across the full width of a 100-kilometer wide fault system simply do not exist at the scale the problem requires. This creates two fundamentally different categories of hazard knowledge within the same fault system. In the first category, faults where you know it's dangerous, you know roughly how often it has ruptured in the past, and you can produce a probabilistic estimate of future rupture that is imprecise but useful. In the second category, faults where you know it's dangerous, the GPS data tells you the overall system is straining at a rate that requires significant seismic energy release, but you cannot tell which specific strands are taking most of the load, which ones are approaching failure, or which ones might rupture next. You have the regional budget, you don't have the line item breakdown. The April 13th earthquake happened in a part of the Walker Lane, the northern Nevada section near Silver Springs, where the subsurface fault characterization sits closer to the second category than the first. The specific fault strand that ruptured was not among the most comprehensively studied segments of the system. And in the days following the main shock, the aftershock sequence has been doing something that aftershock sequences always do in undercharacterized fault zones. It has been revealing geometry. The spatial pattern of aftershocks is showing seismologists where the active structures are in this corridor in ways that the pre-existing maps did not fully capture. Small earthquakes, it turns out, are one of the most effective tools for mapping the faults that produce them. Each aftershock is a data point. Each cluster is a structural signature. The April 13th sequence is, in this sense, contributing real scientific value, illuminating the architecture of a fault zone that needed illuminating. But here is the honest limitation of that process. Aftershock data tells you where the faults are that are currently active. It does not tell you when they last ruptured before April 13th. It does not tell you how large those past ruptures were. It does not give you the recurrence interval. For that, you need trenches. You need sediment cores. You need years of patient, careful, underfunded geological fieldwork in a desert region that does not make the front page. And that work, the work that would give the growing communities of northern Nevada the fault characterization their actual hazard level demands, is ongoing, underfunded relative to the scale of the problem, and years to decades away from being complete. In the meantime, the faults are doing what faults do. They are loading. They are accumulating strain at the rate that GPS confirms, 10 to 12 millimeters per year into the Walker Lane system year after year, distributed across fault strands that we have mapped and fault strands that we have not. The energy budget is real regardless of whether we have completed the accounting. The Walker Lane does not wait for the science to catch up before deciding when to rupture. We are, in the most literal sense, dealing with a system we do not fully understand, in a region we did not fully watch, that just reminded us, on April 13th, that it does not need our attention to keep moving. The blind spots are not gaps in a map, they're gaps in our preparation. and the communities living above those gaps deserve better than a fault system that is more studied in the aftermath of its earthquakes than in the years before them. Part 20. Closing escalation. There is a particular silence that follows a moderate earthquake in a desert region, and it is not the silence of nothing happening. It is the silence of the wrong story being told. No collapsed buildings means no aerial footage. No casualties means no casualty count. No dramatic before and after images means no visual hook for the broadcast. The initial news cycle moves fast. Felt reports. A USGS scientist on the phone describing it as routine, a magnitude and a location and a depth, and then the pivot. Whatever else was trending that night fills the space where the Walker Lane story should have been. The ground shook, nobody died, move on. But that framing, nobody died, move on, is precisely the wrong lesson to take from April 13th. Because the magnitude 5.7 in western Nevada is not a story about what did not happen. It is a story about what it means, what the shaking revealed, what the aftershock pattern indicated, what the location implies about a system that most of the country is not watching and that most of its own residents do not fully understand. And what it means is this: the Walker Lane is active, not dormant, not theoretical, not the earthquake hazard of some distant future that planners can defer to the next budget cycle. It is here, it is loaded, it just moved, and it has done this before at scales that dwarf what April 13th produced in a corridor that is no longer empty desert. Let me give you the two ways to interpret what happened, because there are genuinely two, and being honest about both of them matters. In the first interpretation, April 13th was a routine stress release event. A moderate earthquake on a moderately active fault system, releasing accumulated strain from a small portion of the Walker Lane, followed by a normal aftershock sequence that will decay over the coming weeks and leave the system in a slightly more relaxed state than it was before the main shock. This is the interpretation that the USGS scientist on the phone was gesturing toward, and in a strict probabilistic sense, it is probably the more likely one. Most moderate earthquakes are main shocks. Most aftershock sequences do not escalate into something larger. Most of the time, the crust processes these events quietly, rebalances, and moves on. The 5 to 10% probability that any given moderate earthquake turns out to be a foreshock means that 9 times out of 10, it doesn't. Statistically, routine is the most likely answer. But here is the second interpretation, and this one deserves to be taken seriously, not as a prediction, but as a possibility that the Walker Lane's own history forces us to keep on the table. In the second interpretation, April 13th was a diagnostic event, a seismological stress test that revealed the Walker Lane's current state of activation. That demonstrated, with real ground motion felt across 2 states, its capacity to produce wide area shaking from a relatively moderate rupture. That generated an aftershock sequence elongated along the structural trend of the fault system in ways consistent with multiple fault strands responding to a common regional stress field. In this interpretation, April 13th is not the story. It is the opening statement of a story whose next chapters have not yet been written, and the Walker Lane's own history tells us what those chapters can look like. December 16th, 1954. The Fairview Peak fault ruptures at magnitude 7.1. A massive earthquake by any measure, surface rupture visible from the air, ground displacement measurable in meters, shaking felt across a huge area of central Nevada. Seismologists begin processing the data, and then, 4 minutes later, the Dixie Valley fault ruptures at magnitude 7.0. A second major earthquake on a different fault strand, 40 kilometers away, triggered by the stress change from the first one. 2 magnitude 7 earthquakes in 4 minutes. The Walker Lane, in 1954, demonstrated in real time that it does not produce isolated events. It produces sequences. It produces chain reactions. It is a networked mechanical system that can take a rupture on one fault strand and translate it, through Coulomb stress transfer, into a rupture on the next one, sometimes within minutes. The 1915 Pleasant Valley rupture, the 1932 Cedar Mountain rupture, the 1954 double event. 4 magnitude 7 or greater earthquakes in 111 years, in a system that is still loading, still straining, still accumulating the energy that GPS stations measure at 10 to 12 millimeters per year, year after year, without pause. The Walker Lane's modern seismic history is not a history of isolated events separated by coincidence. It is a history of a system expressing itself, sometimes quietly, sometimes catastrophically, in a region that has only recently acquired the population and infrastructure to make the difference matter. That is the interpretive fork that April 13th leaves us standing at. Routine stress release or opening statement. And the honest answer, the one that seismology actually supports, is that we do not know which one it is yet. The monitoring continues, the aftershock sequence is still being watched, the stress models are still being run. The answer will become clearer over days and weeks, and it may never become fully clear because the distinction between a main shock and a foreshock is often only legible in retrospect. That uncertainty is not a failure of the science, it is the nature of the system. What is not uncertain is the larger picture. The Walker Lane is an active, distributed plate boundary scale fault system. It is accumulating strain at a GPS-confirmed rate that requires substantial seismic energy release over time. It runs through the third most seismically hazardous state in the United States. It cuts directly through a metropolitan corridor of hundreds of thousands of people, billions of dollars of infrastructure, military installations, data centers, and the economic machinery of one of the fastest-growing regions in the American West. Its fault geometry is complex enough, and its mapping incomplete enough, that the specific location, timing, and magnitude of the next large rupture cannot be predicted with confidence. And on April 13th, 2026, it reminded anyone paying attention that it is not waiting for us to be ready. The April 13th earthquake exposed the Walker Lane to a moment of public attention that it rarely receives. The question, and this is the question that matters most, the one that determines whether April 13th produces any lasting consequence beyond the seismograph record, is whether that attention is sustained, whether it translates into the geological mapping programs that the region's fault system desperately needs, the paleoseismic investigations that would give planners and engineers actual recurrence data for the faults currently characterized as unknown, the infrastructure assessments that would honestly evaluate how Reno's bridges, Carson City's government buildings, and the Interstate 80 corridor's critical transportation links would perform in a Walker Lane magnitude 7.2. The public education campaigns that would give the hundreds of thousands of people who have moved into this corridor in the last 2 decades the earthquake awareness that their actual hazard level demands, the emergency preparedness planning that would make the difference between a survivable disaster and an unmanageable one. Whether any of that happens is a political and institutional question, not a geological one. The geology has already made its case. It made the case in 1915 when Pleasant Valley ruptured at magnitude 7.2 and 60 kilometers of desert floor tore open in seconds. It made the case in 1954 when the Walker Lane delivered 2 magnitude 7 earthquakes in 4 minutes to an empty basin in central Nevada. It made the case again on April 13th, 2026, when a magnitude 5.7 in the Silver Springs corridor sent shaking across a mountain range and into the California Central Valley, and generated an aftershock sequence that is still being analysed as this video goes out. The geology keeps making the case. The case keeps being filed and forgotten. The Walker Lane does not care whether we are paying attention. This is the thing about tectonic systems that is simultaneously obvious and somehow easy to lose sight of in the daily noise of the news cycle. The plates are moving at the same rate they moved before April 13th. They will move at the same rate after the aftershock sequence fades and the USGS press release drops off the search results, and the next news cycle arrives with something louder and more visually compelling to replace it. The strain is accumulating across fault strands that we have mapped and fault strands that we have not. The stress is loading in the crust beneath communities that are growing, fast, confidently, with remarkable energy, without full awareness of what lies beneath them. The system that produced 4 magnitude 7 earthquakes in 111 years is not done producing magnitude 7 earthquakes. It will produce more, on a timescale of decades to centuries, in a corridor that in 1915 held almost no one, and in 2026 holds hundreds of thousands of people and everything they have built. What you are standing on matters. It has always mattered. The earthquake you have not heard of, the one without the famous name, the one that did not destroy a recognizable city in a televised moment of catastrophe, the one running through the Nevada desert rather than the California coast, may be the one that defines the seismic story of the 21st century in the American West. The Walker Lane ruptured on April 13th. It will rupture again. The only question that remains genuinely open is whether the people living above it will understand what they are standing on before the ground decides to tell them. Because the Earth does not issue press releases, it does not hold briefings, it does not care about coverage cycles, or the relative fame of fault systems, or whether the news moved on. It moves when it moves. And in the Walker Lane, in the crust of western Nevada, on the night of April 13th, 2026, it moved. The question is whether we were listening, and whether we will still be listening tomorrow.